Good morning, folks. This is our COIL Conversation today. My name is Larry Reagan. I'm one of the directors of the Center for Online Innovation and Learning. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our program this morning. Our topic this morning is student data, who owns it and how is it being used. And it's an opportunity to talk about ethics and privacy and a wide-ranging set of concerns around this topic. We know it's all hot. I understand Chris Millay is going to be our lead moderator. You could not get Edwin Snowden. I know you tried. He wasn't available. But you've really put together a great panel today, so we're looking forward to a wide-ranging set of conversations. I will inform the group who's joining us at a distance that in our chat box of the meeting site, please enter your questions or comments, and I will channel those. Also, I would ask the panelists if you should be also watching and you want to respond dynamically, feel free to do that as well. So, Chris, thank you for putting this together. This is going to be a lot of fun today.
Great. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. As Larry mentioned, we're talking about student data, the concept of ownership of data, and we'll cover topics such as ethics and privacy. I also want to delve into a little bit the sort of practical applications of why we might want to use student data for different things and why we're having this conversation in the first place. Before I get too deeply into that, I wanted to provide an opportunity for the panelists to introduce themselves and maybe also a word or two about how this topic intersects with what you're doing professionally. You can start now.
Hi everyone, I'm Simon Hooper. I am in the Learning Design and Technology program in the College of Education, and I am very interested in data, and in particular in using data to support teaching and learning. And so I have a couple of my own projects where I'm designing software and using data, giving that data back in different forms for people to use. And I'm also working with Chris and the other people down at ETS on the analytics project that we have going with the math department. That's it.
Hello, I'm Maureen Sperling. I'm an educational psychologist, and I'm sort of working on the analytics project as well. My interest is in student self-regulation and using data to inform student decision-making and strategy use. And so my interest in the analytics is how do we provide data that can be useful to the student in making day-to-day decisions.
Good morning, I'm Crystal Ramsey. I'm at the Schreier Institute for Teaching Excellence, the university's teaching center, and I'm a research associate and instructional consultant there. And while I wear a lot of hats there, one in particular is focused on assessment and working with faculty on assessment and looking at evidence of student learning and how we can feed that back to students and from an instructional perspective, how we can improve the teaching and learning experience at the classroom level in particular. So I'm interested in this topic and the ways that it informs that kind of decision making.
So, so this idea of data ownership is coming up a lot sort of in the popular media quite a bit as we hear about the types of things that Facebook and Google are doing with our data. Oftentimes those stories are sort of cast in a very negative light in the ways that these companies are misusing the data, the way that they're kind of overreaching in terms of what privacy policies they have in place, and sort of have these privacy policies or this shifting sort of landscape that makes us constantly unaware of what they're doing and how they're using our data. And some really scary stuff there, and things that we should all be really paying attention to. The interesting sort of other flip side of the coin, though, is that these are things that we think about and that we get concerned about, but our students and young people in general have perhaps a slightly different perception than we do about what's acceptable use of their data. And I think that in general they're loose about it. And we actually had Larry and Brad and I had some interesting conversations before you guys all arrived about this. Brad and I both have children that are sort of 2 years old or younger, and I have a Facebook profile for my daughter, and I have pictures and things that I post in there. And so right from the beginning of her lifetime, she has sort of her life chronicled in her Facebook account. And what does that mean for her as she grows up and she's old enough that she sort of gets to inherit this? If there is Facebook, I'm assuming that there is going to be Facebook in 15 years, but when she inherits this, how is she going to feel about having all that data out there about her? And so there's really sort of interesting questions. We feel differently about this than our students do. And that's just sort of Facebook. So how do they feel about how we use the educational data as they come to Penn State? Do they know that we have this data about them and that we're using it in different ways? This conversation is particularly timely in addition to sort of what's happening, the national conversation at Penn State. We, about 5 months ago, signed a contract with a learning analytics vendor called Civitas Learning. We are in the process of implementing this product, and actually Brian and Andy have been part of some of that stuff. What we're doing right now is sort of the beginning part of a typical sort of learning analytics workflow. So what we're doing right now is packaging our data up and sending it to this company to begin analyzing. They will spend the next couple months making sense of our data and extracting trends in student behaviors, starting to understand more, at least from the standpoint of what our data tells us, what are the risk factors that contribute to perhaps students dropping out early from Penn State, what are the things that typify a very successful student at Penn State, and building a learning analytics model, essentially, that we will then wrap a product around that we'll be able to put in the hands of our various stakeholders at Penn State. So once that sort of initial analysis process happens, we'll have to make some decisions, strategic decisions about who gets access to the insights that are generated through this analytics process. And that could be administration at Penn State, it could be advisors, people that are trained to interpret this data and have facilitated conversations with students, or, and this is particularly interesting for me, I think for our panelists as well, is actually putting the insights into the hands of faculty and students themselves and see what they do. So really putting it as close as possible to the people that this data is about, that they can make the most use of. So some interesting decisions around that product, and obviously along those lines and other decisions we have to make are what are the policies we need to put around this product and things like learning analytics in general. How do we communicate to students? I know that at Purdue, one of the early products, Purdue Signals, Course Signals, they had a data bill of rights. That there was a public document that they shared with students, and they said, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're not going to do with your data. And we're really transparent about the process. So do we need to be doing that sort of thing? So some tricky things, and hopefully we'll unpack some of that in this conversation. But it is really interesting, and this is the first time I think that we're really comprehensively looking at our data and thinking about ways that that data can really directly impact students on a day-to-day basis. And there's huge opportunities. I'm really excited about this. I think that this will be a really good thing for Penn State, but there's also some big risks. And so therefore, I think it's important to be having this conversation and really be talking really honestly about what we're doing. So with that said, I want to engage our panelists here and ask my first question, which is that the university, as I've mentioned, maintains an enormous amount of data about students from when they apply here and all the admissions data that we have about them through all the things that they do as their students here, interacting in the various systems that we have, digital systems that we have in place for them to learn within. And then, when they become alumni and we engage them in that capacity, there's a really long history of data we have about every single student. And my question to the panel is who owns all that data about those students? What does the term ownership even mean when it comes to data? And then to what extent do students that this data pertains to, what rights do they have to govern how it's used? So whoever wants to jump on that first.
Go ahead.
Okay. So when I think about this, what I want to do at the beginning is to define my terms. So I want to know what it means to own something. And I also want to know what we're talking about when we say data. So when it comes to ownership, it seems to me the first thing is that there's an old saying is that possession is 9 points of the law. And it seems to me it's pretty clear that Penn State has possession of lots and lots of data, and probably therefore has ownership. But in addition to having ownership, it also has responsibilities. And those responsibilities are driven by various guidelines and policies and laws. And Penn State has lots of these policies and guidelines, and there is a law in place. There's a FERPA law, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and that essentially says that students have the right to be able to inspect educational records and to amend those records, and that there are various guidelines on the limits to which an institution can share those records. So it seems to me, first of all, that there are those guidelines in place, and I'll elaborate a little bit later on some of that. The second thing to define is data, and when I think about data, one of the things that I find really useful is just to think about what is often called the knowledge hierarchy, which is a very simple way of looking at data, and it's DIKW, data, information, knowledge, and wisdom, which is it's a hierarchy. There are lots of different hierarchies. But I find it useful to look at that one in particular and to say, well, if we just look at raw data on its own is not interesting. That's essentially ones and zeros or similar things. Data only become interesting when they are turned into information. And they become information when there are connections that are made. And those connections could be, typically at somewhere like Penn State, we think that a connection will be something like there is a student who's taken a course and received a grade. But very quickly what happens is you realize that that connection becomes more complex, and that has implications. So what actually happens is a student takes a course, gets a grade, and that course had an instructor. But then it also becomes more complex when you say the student took a course and they got a grade from an instructor at an institution. And so what we're now dealing with is much more than just saying that whose data is it. It's more than just the student's data. It has implications for the instructor, and it also has implications for the institution. And so without actually answering the question, because I'll use that framework as we continue to talk, I have found it useful to distinguish between different types of data and different, I suppose, owners of that data.
Do you want to go, Krista? No, go ahead. I think that your comments are really interesting. I'm sort of overwhelmed by the scope of the nature of the data that we collect. And the thing that I kept coming back to as I thought about these questions is that I think that the students don't have awareness of the nature of the data that we collect as well, and what data we might be sharing with other entities. So I think it's different to suggest who owns the data versus what data are there and how can we convey to students that these are the types of things that we have on you or about you that we are sharing with these entities. And I think that students will, my personal opinion is that students will be surprised when they realize how much information and data we have about them and the ways that it's being used. When we talk about the analytics project, one of the things that's been concerning to me is that I would say we're not very good yet at using those data to predict anything very reliably. And so if we're talking about giving feedback or information to students in your hierarchy, I want to make sure that the information that we're providing to them has implicit meaning, that they can use that information for something useful, or decision making, I should say. So if we're collecting data about students and their interactions with a teacher or their previous grades or whatever regression type models we're using to predict student behavior or success, I think that we need to be pretty careful about the data that we use to make those models and being able to share that those models have some predictive power.
So one quick clarification, just because we're talking about the analytics project and we're talking about Civitas. The way that we decided to approach approach analytics at Penn State, and this was partly by a suggestion that was made to me by George Siemens, who, if you don't know him, he's sort of one of the fathers of modern sort of learning analytics movement, and has been here at Penn State a few times. He cautioned us to not jump into a vendor relationship until we had competencies around analytics internally. So some of the projects that we've engaged in that Rand's referring to around Math 110, had the purpose of that project was really to build those competencies. So we're definitely not doing it the best way that we possibly can. There's gaps in the way that we're doing it, but it's not sort of going to be the way that the university is going to proceed in terms of analytics from an official capacity would be through Civitas. But the nice thing about having those projects and being involved in those projects is it makes us much more sophisticated in the way that we interact with somebody like Civitas, that we're not just coming into this totally cold. So just wanted to differentiate in terms of when we talk about analytics at Penn State, it means a couple different things.
And it also means different end users,
Yes.
right? So student as end user, teacher as end user, institution as end user. I think that plays an important role in how we talk about the data as well.
Yeah, that's actually what I was kind of thinking about in combination with Simon's point about responsibility. So what responsibilities are there if you own the data? And from a faculty perspective, which is the perspective I kind of represent, is if I suddenly have data, what is my responsibility to use it? Okay, so if I find out that data indicate that maybe a change to this or that related to my course might improve student outcomes, I'm suddenly obligated, I would think, to make change or not. Or how do we define that? Or if you talk about students suddenly having knowledge about their own performance, we hope they would make change in good ways. But all of this assumes understanding and interpretability, and thinking about something I've been reading more about recently is digital fluency. To what extent are faculty able to extract the analytic data that's already available to them, even in Angel? To what extent do they even know it's there? And once they know it's there, what do they do with it? And how do they make sense of it? And then most importantly, how do they translate that into change for students? And so there's a lot of responsibility there, coupled with skill and training, and who decides what training is appropriate, who decides what training is necessary, what obligations go with that training and responsibility. And none of that is small. It's really important. So coupled with ownership is responsibility, and what does that look like and who shapes it?
Would you mind if I ask just one clarifying question on this? Simon, you might be the best one to respond to it. Is there, when you're defining data, is there a difference between data about me, who I am, sort of almost the demographics, versus how I behave or what I do? Do we draw that distinction at all? Is it necessary? I don't know. I'm just wondering if in the field, do people look at that?
Well, data about you is fairly public. So there is a university policy on that. So they call it directory information, and they say specifically that can be passed on. But then there's other information, and that there are policies that deal with data as it relates to students and what can be done with that. And so there are clearly limitations in terms of what can be done with it. But I think that the policies that exist are very limited and were written for a bygone era. And I think that the issues that we have, or definitely that we're going to have, are going to be much broader. They're going to have broader scope in terms of the groups of people who they affect. And they're going to have, as we start to build models, and probably ultimately quite powerful models, there are going to be really important implications for how that data is used, not only in terms of passing it on to other people, but also in terms of giving it back to the individual. And I know that Rain has some really interesting ideas on that.
Thank you.
And I wanted to add something about that whole idea of data provided by students too versus data collected about students, perhaps without their even knowing, right? So if I'm a student in a class, I've provided information knowingly. I've answered questions to get into the institution. I may have answered questions that the instructor has asked me. I go into the LMS and I provide information. I think it's reasonable to assume that I'm okay with at least the instructor or the institution having that information. The fact that my every click is tracked and that my behavior could somehow be profiled, and I'm not sure, you know, a lot of what we're talking about today are boundaries and parameters and appropriateness, and I think that's one of the places where there need to be boundaries and what they look like. Some may be already established in terms of policy, and others may, I think, will have to be determined.
So I want to go deeper on
Communication.
some.
I'm sorry, and communication about those boundaries.
Right,
That's
right.
the important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to go some deeper on some things that you mentioned, which was sort of training and students' ability to interpret this data, and then also talk a little bit more about FERPA. So students can make these FERPA requests. They can go to the university and say, I want to know everything that you have about me, anything that's considered a student record, which includes, you know, if I went to the advisor and any notes the advisor took, that would be a record, all the things that these different systems collect about, and then all the admissions data, those sorts of things. I'm wondering if we do provide those to students. What are your feelings about our students' capabilities to interpret that data and make good decisions about it? And is it an obligation of ours to package that data and train the students and help them step through the interpretation of the data in order to make good decisions? Or is that what an advisor does? So is the existing advising model that we have at Penn State, which is very good, nationally recognized for the quality of advising that we provide students, is that what that's for? I mean,
I don't think that we're very good at that yet. I don't think that we haven't put the data pieces together in a coherent, cohesive kind of way to provide effective information. And that's one of the things that I'm concerned about. So if we provide students feedback or information and they're going to be making recommendations upon that data, I think that we have to be really clear that we know what we're sharing. I don't think we know that yet.
I think there are grain size issues too, you know, so learning analytics is also about what I as an instructor might collect in terms of data about my students and their interactions, say, in online courses. And so if I somehow can feed back to them that in sort of an established protocol sort of way, you know, so we've been looking at level of discussion in this class. It really doesn't go beyond, perhaps. And what we find is that students do better in this class when they participate at a particular level. And so you might try, you know, that doesn't seem quite as scary as, you know, much bigger kinds of decisions you might make on much greater data and lots of different data points and lots of different variables. But that doesn't mean it couldn't be immediately useful. I think faculty are all the time trying to figure out how to, I mean, a lot of this has to do with personalization of an instructional experience and how do you personalize it in a way that's meaningful and appropriate and respects privacy and guidelines and all of that. But once you start scaling beyond that, it starts to get a little scarier.
Yeah, even if we take the grain size, though, of the class situation. So I'm concerned about the width of our ability to predict in these models. So say, for example, we have a bandwidth that says you're an A-B student. Right, and I'm going to give you feedback based upon, you know, if you've gone to the outside tutoring sources, how many practice problems you've done, these academic behaviors in this class, right? And the bandwidth is you're an AB student. There's so much variance within the AB student bandwidth that if you say students that are like you, which is the language we've been using, students who are like you are doing these types of behaviors. Well, the B student in that bandwidth who has less prior knowledge, less experience, isn't engaging in the same types of behaviors or not engaging in the behaviors like maybe the A students in that band already have taken the class or have huge amounts of prior knowledge, and so the behaviors that they're engaging in are not predictive of the B student in that same band. So our models aren't fine-grained enough to be able to provide, in my opinion, to be able to provide information that students can make adequate decisions on, even at the class level. But
Well, and
ideally,
those are a lot of variables in the model.
right.
Right, so once you start adding more and more variables, it gets increasingly more complex.
And that's my question, is it the problem, the quality of the model, is the problem the quality of the data?
Both.
Ultimately, analytics is about decision making. And it seems that we have in our possession the ability to gather massive amounts of information. And there's quite a lot that's being done on the representation of that information, and that's really interesting. But that third step in the process is taking that information and its representations and being able to change your decision making in some way, or to be able to make effective decisions. And again, it affects the student, it affects the instructor, and it affects the institution. So at the instructor level, Crystal's been talking about that, about how there's lots of information that an instructor can take from an analytics system, and they can use that to change their instruction in various ways. And there's lots that can be done, there's lots that's being talked about the student. But it also has implications for the institution, because the institution is going to be getting lots of information about what it knows to be effective and what it knows to be ineffective instruction. So if, for example, the institution has information about, let's suppose that there is a core course, let's call it Math 100, and it's taken by several hundred students a year, and the institution finds out that there is a very high failure or dropout rate in that course. What are the implications for the institution? What are the obligations for the institution in terms of either improving that course or letting it be known to potential customers of that course?
I think an interesting question is, how do you arrive at that finding in the first place, that there's this realization that students are doing poorly in this course? What drives that? The fact that we have data, so let's do something with it, or the fact that we have questions, so we go to this rich data source to try to answer them? I mean, that's a rhetorical question, but there are different things that can drive the research. So is it the fact that the data are available, or that we want to know things about the data, specific things?
I want to go back to what Crystal was saying about obligation on the faculty end. So now you have this day one prediction of these are the characteristics of students based upon data about you and data and behaviors that you might engage in the class. And I have a fairly high ability to predict that you're going to fail this class. Is it the instructor's obligation to share that with the student and to give them a realistic expectation about their potential performance? And
Well, in terms of student rights as well, if a student finds out that a faculty member has a very accurate prediction of their success and doesn't do anything about it, and they're failing that course, does the student have the ability to come back to the faculty member and say, you're responsible for this? You knew that I was going to have problems and didn't do anything about it. I wonder if there's sort of that's a future that we'll face.
Yeah, well, 2 words: Minority Report. Yeah. So for those of you not familiar with Minority Report, it was a movie that came out about 10 or 12 years ago. It was a sci-fi where there were 3 people known as precogs who were able to predict crime before it occurred. And so the potential perpetrators were arrested and jailed before the crimes actually occurred. And that could mean up to life in prison for a murder that you would have committed. That's right. So if you take that and you put that into an educational context, if we have this information where we are very sure of the outcome, what do we do with such data? How should that be used? Which I think is what you're talking about.
Do you mind if I jump in with a question? So I would suggest that as teachers for thousands of years, we've used predictive analytics in our teaching experiences, right? We look at classes, we make intuitive. I mean, good instructors, this is what they do. Do they also, if I know I have a student in my class without any of the technical infrastructure, I also have or feel an obligation to intervene or to do something with that student. How different is that now we have maybe technical data as well, the ones and zeros that also give us information? How does that change the scenario of what my obligation is? Well, that was a good question, or not.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I was thinking before even coming in here about when are the data collected? Are data collected? Chris, you kind of opened up the conversation talking about data have been historically collected, and we have semesters worth of data. And to what extent does that predict how students might do now? As an instructor, without all of that information, my decisions are going to be made based on what you do here and now, and I might adjust all along the way, but I don't have benefit of all these other predictive kinds of things. And it's really interesting, though, that this conversation is largely about big data, analytics, models, all this very scientific, statistical kind of modeling stuff, and yet what we're talking about is fundamentally a human endeavor, packed with all sorts of humanness. You know, we know that for a student who may be predicted to fail a course, if matched with a different instructor, that can be a game changer. But who would predict that necessarily? You know, that, and maybe those aren't, maybe there aren't lots of those examples, but in terms of, you know, human development over the scope of a student, regardless of whether they're sort of a more traditional student, an adult student, the kinds of experiences they undergo when they're in instructional environments or in higher ed in general, you know, how well can our models really predict, and what variables can we not account for?
Well, and I mean, one of the things that interests me, and I think that this sort of speaks to human nature, is the idea that we have, I get a little philosophical here, but that we have free will, that this data, no matter how much data you have and how good your models are, they can't possibly predict everything about what a student. What if I look at 15 years of data, I build really strong models, I use really good statistical techniques, and my models are 95% accurate, that I know that you're going to fill out of this course from the moment that you walk in the door. And there's no, you know, it's a mathematical fact that I'm just saying hypothetically. So just, you know, we can say, oh, that, oh, it's missing these just human factors, but what do you say if the model is that accurate?
I don't think our models will be that accurate.
So I think that Austin P State University had a analytics application that they could predict failure with 85% accuracy, and they proved this year over year that the model was that accurate. So maybe not 95%, but 85% is pretty good, and that's probably better than the human beings that were looking at that data and making intuitive judgments about it.
One of the things
Yeah,
that, go ahead.
It's a thing about Larry, but isn't it how you use the data? Because you're talking about probability here. But I was thinking when you teach, if you have a project the group's working on, one student appears to be disengaged, you make assumptions, but the student may be the fact that parents been going through divorce and they're disengaged because of outside issues. I mean, so isn't it how you use the data? Because we have a lot of data now. Bring your own recreational management has students keep a 2-week record of every half an hour of their behavior. And they talk about, I mean, we have a lot of data, isn't it? How we use it, but it's not going to be black or white. It's still, as Chris said, it's free will. The students say, well, it looks like I'm not going to do well. But the student choose or use a factor, say every student who's taking this course who didn't take this other one, you've been using that data forever.
For me, it changes the nature of the conversation. And this is what often happens with technology. So as a learning designer, I love to think about the affordances of different technologies. And one of the things that I'm very much aware of is that affordances aren't something that naturally exist within technologies. They emerge. And they emerge based upon the way that people use technologies. So for example, before Facebook, people communicated with each other. But because of Facebook, something happened, something really profound happened that's affected the entire world and the way that the world communicates. So at the moment, we have courses at universities. And we're talking about learning analytics, and we're assuming that The analytic systems are going to have an impact on the way, on students and the way that courses are taught. My belief is that it's going to fundamentally change the nature of the course at the university. And that instead of having this model where people come in and they're expected to take a course and you take it over a period of time and you end up and you have, let's say, an examination at the end and you get a grade. I think that what's going to happen is that universities are going to be moved much closer towards models that are very popular in public education at the moment. And in public education, the movement is towards customization. That is not the model that we have in higher education. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth in most cases. What we do instead is we force everybody into the same hopper and we say, you go take that course and we'll see what happens at the other end. As opposed to saying, let's see where you are, let's see where we can move you, let's see how far we can move you. Instead of saying, let's get everybody to the same finishing line and see how people compare when they get to that finishing line. And part of that, I believe, is going to be it's only a piece of it, but I think an important part of it is going to be the competency-based education model that COIL has been so involved with. And this is the idea of saying we're much more interested in what it is that a person can do as opposed to saying, let's just force you through a course and see where you are at the end of it. And in such a model, if we've got predictive analytics in place, I think that they can be used quite differently. They can be used to say, here are resources, here are ways to allow you to build towards your goal. So ultimately what I see is that the affordances of the technology change the system.
I think they can change the system in another way. So I'm a student that comes to university, and I know that you have all of these data that predict, and this is one of your later questions, all of these data that predict how successful I'm going to be in this particular class, we'll say. Well, you also know how successful I will be in this class with a different instructor. And what's the obligation to maintain effective instruction once we know, based upon these models, who's not being an effective teacher? And that's going to change things.
I think part of it too is, you were talking about, Simon, the idea has been in sort of K-12, or we've been seeing this in K-12 customization. And I think Chris, the COIL team, provided as a link today, is his name Todd Rose, and he talked about the myth of the average. In Universal Design for Learning, they've been talking about that for many years and saying when we teach to the middle, we can miss the majority. And it's the same thing. And he's saying it now, they've been saying it for a long time, but the idea that we really can and need to personalize instruction. So I think, Chris, you were talking about a lot of opportunities here, and I think we're raising a lot of questions and concerns and things we have to be mindful of, but it's really a tremendous opportunity to put information in the hands of students to help instructors personalize to the extent possible, but then for students to get sort of diagnostic information to guide them as well. But how do you give it to them in a way that they can do something with it? What does my learning report look like, or what does that look like, and how do students make sense of it, and what obligations do instructors have, and when do we pull from my class because a student's going to fail in my class, but if they go to Rain's class, prediction is they'll do better in. So just so many, I think, great opportunities, but with lots of caveats.
Yeah, and somebody like Civitas is only going to be able to answer so many questions for us. The nice thing is that I think they recognize that we're an R1 institution. We're going to want to do a lot of research around this area. So it's very much, in addition to sort of the product that they're providing us, they're also providing us with a research partnership opportunity. So I think that we'll be able to use APIs and do some different things to get into the underneath the hood and to craft our own questions, maybe questions that are specific to Penn State, and do some research around there. So I want to make sure that everybody knows that they can sort of jump into the conversation. We've covered a lot of area here, and we can dive in anything deeper that you guys want, including people that are online. But
Do you mind if I channel one for you?
Sure.
So David Stone, one of our colleagues, is asking about, this goes back a little bit to the policy questions, but David is asking, what existing policies do you see that partially or indirectly reference student data? What are some of the gaps that you see that still need to be addressed? And he said, I'm referring to Penn State policies and procedures. Rain, you had made a couple comments about maybe we're not quite there yet, or we don't have coverage that we might need to.
Yeah, I think Simon knows more about this than I do, because you've been doing some research on the FERPA policies and then looking at Penn State policies too.
Right. So this week I just looked up some of the policies, I started off by reading through FERPA and trying to understand that, and then I looked at the policies and guidelines from Penn State, and essentially what they do is they refer back to that FERPA document, and they say we're going to implement the policies that allow us to not break the law. And so they didn't strike me as being very sophisticated. They weren't very deep. They were just saying that you have access to you can have access to your information. We'll correct your information if it's wrong, and we will allow it out under certain conditions.
Do you see those policies as being, is the intent of being more in line with legal ramifications rather than with serving the student, or the way you're saying it? Is that how they're written, or is that our reaction right now is more sort of from a legal perspective?
I think so. It would be interesting to go to the documents and look at when they were written. I doubt that they've changed much in recent years.
So one interesting thing about FERPA is that we talk about FERPA in light of how it protects students' rights, and they can make these FERPA requests. But the other part of FERPA is that it also allows us as an institution to use that data for improvement of that student's experience. So that's part of it. It protects students, but it also protects the institution in order for us to do our business, which it should. And it's the same thing like copyright. People like to talk about copyright in the ways that it restricts people's ability to use intellectual property. But the other thing that copyright does is it encourages innovation by allowing people to have protection of their intellectual property. So these laws sort of have both two sides to them. FERPA is the same thing. FERPA is a really good thing. It's not just a thing that constricts what we can do, but it actually provides guidelines for us to do all kinds of interesting stuff, including learning analytics.
But I think that there's a difference between data and information underneath this FERPA, sort of umbrella. So yes, you can protect your data, but I don't think students recognize that we're making connections among these pieces of data, or even the scope of what we mean by data when we start talking about analytics.
I don't believe FERPA actually covers that. FERPA is really just sharing with a third party with a lot of that data. So internal use is kind of fuzzy in FERPA. I mean, Chris and I have had that discussion many times. But we consider the data stewards for much of our data that we generate. So
Is Civitas a third party though?
it is, and we have a contract with them.
And
However, COIL is interesting. When we have a grant through COIL, is that a third party? Would Rain's research be a third party versus Rain delivering her class and wanting to know how to deliver a class? So a lot of that is, what do you really think of a third party? So continuous improvement on your own instruction is different than your research. I'm not sure how that gets classified.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that.
Right? So what happens with the research, that goes through a different arm, and that goes through IRB approval and so on to make sure that it's considered there. But for internal use, I'm not sure Penn State has determined, can we get that data to the people that use it? And will those people that use it properly?
So this tails into my next question, which is something that we've kind of danced around, but I'd like to address it head on, is this idea of ethics and privacy considerations. What are some of the, let's talk about some of the potential misuses of this data. I mean, if as an example, if a faculty member has some sort of list of risk factors for a particular set of students, and they decide to write off, like, these students they have a high probability of failing this course. There's nothing I can do to help that. I'm just going to write them off, and I'll just concentrate on the middle students that need my help the most. There's things like that. So what are the other misuses that can be made of this data or these analytics, and maybe how do we mitigate those things? It's sort of a scary question. But. And I wish that the Moses from Educational Equity was here, because I've had some conversations with Educational Equity about that, about you know, how if there's demographic data that's tied up in some of these analytics, how that could be used to target particular student populations, particular student types.
Chris, I think that that's a really interesting perspective and question, because it raises for me the question about why are we here? I mean, aren't we here to serve students and to take students from point A to point B? So if we do, as you suggest, look at that data and say, oh, I'm just not going to serve that population, in essence, I'm just going to concentrate where I know I'll have success. Do we miss the opportunity to move somebody from that 95% they're going to fail and give them opportunities to give them the skill sets and the training? Isn't that what we're here for?
One of the things that I find shocking at institutions of higher education is that not everybody believes what you have just said. So for many, they instead, I believe, have more of a sieve model where they are attempting to sort students rather than to serve them. And their goal is to find out who are the best students in a certain field, to be able to identify them, so they can be presumably employed by the best companies or to go on to graduate school or whatever, as opposed to moving on individual students in their careers. And I think that that's a big issue for institutions of higher education to have to deal with. And because of the nature of our institutions, there is no simple resolution to it.
Can I just ask the question then? Do you think that there is room and need for both? For example, the example I always give in that is I'm not sure I want to have a brain surgeon operating on me who was marginal and who perhaps didn't have the skill sets, but the faculty really worked with them in order to succeed, but maybe they really shouldn't be in brain surgery. So is there a place where those kind of competencies need to be sorted out differently than in other domains?
Nobody jumps on that because I like to say that, so there is a need for a competency-based modular kind of approach where everybody can succeed. And I think people at universities don't provide that, other people will. So I think there's no place for a brain surgeon who has not mastered everything. But I don't think that you get there by sorting. So we have organizations that are now sorting people. And we will have soon really good information with which educational institutions can understand who you are and provide an appropriate path for you. And instead of saying, you are likely to fail this course, they'll say, I see you struggle with calculus. This is a better path on this piece of what you need to know based on the fact that you've had trouble with calculus. So we're going to take a different approach for you than somebody who's sailed right through calculus. So I think that people will soon be able to choose whether they want to go to a place where they'll be sorted or to a place where they'll be served.
Kyle, when is that sort of thing an advising responsibility versus an instructor responsibility? So back to the sieve versus sort idea, there's an instructor on campus right now who this semester is teaching 1,600 students face-to-face. I'm guessing there will probably be both. And this is a really thoughtful, really wonderful instructor in many ways, who cares deeply about competency, who cares deeply about student learning, and works tirelessly to optimize the learning experience in a not very optimal learning environment. 1,600 face-to-face students is a lot. So what kind of data do we give to that instructor to make a difference? Or what kind of data does that instructor share with students? And then what is the nature of the decisions? That person, how do we direct students when there are so many, or in online environments, for example, when we have hundreds and maybe thousands of students? How do we
So I'd say that that instructor, who may be very compassionate, very capable, instructor has been put into a civ educational environment. I think what will happen, and by the way, if you haven't read Horace's Compromise, he talks about how an English teacher in high school with so many people to teach how to write, and how that's crazy because every time you assign a 2-page assignment, you get this much. I mean, sometimes the system is wrong for accomplishing learning. But what we'll see, I believe, is systems like Newton. And if you haven't seen it, we have a COIL Fisher presentation from Jose Ferrer. I can never say that. The CEO that describes that, and Smart Sparrow. And there are going to be these adaptive learning systems within that. So I give you this lecture to really inspire you. Lectures are really good at inspiring. They're not really that good at teaching. And then I send you through this adaptive branching kind of a pathway that adapts. So I think the combination of new technologies and that lecturer who can, you know, share his or her passion for the subject and so on, I think that's where the synergy I'm looking for comes from.
And that gets at Simon's point about transforming the whole experience in higher ed. We're not
That's where it's
talking about
exciting.
what we do now
It is.
and injecting information from learning analytics. We're talking about a need to transform.
And here we
Teaching
are,
and
we
learning
live at
experience.
this moment when all this is happening. We're like scholars in this area, the people who control all this. How cool is that? That we are going to be the ones who determine how well and when this happens.
So one of the sort of common products that are tied to learning analytics systems is like degree mapping tools or degree navigation tools. And the sort of the high-level overview of how this might work is that a student is in a particular program, maybe they're in their second year, they have so many credits behind them, they've got certain grades in the courses that they've taken so far. They can go to one of these degree mapping tools and basically compare how they're doing right now in the program that they're in versus a bunch of other possibilities. So I might want to switch majors because something is of interest to me or whatever reason, or I'm not doing really well. And so this is sort of this opportunity for personalization and allows them to have a little bit more data to make that decision a little bit more smartly. You could also look at it if you're more cynical about it and say those algorithms are going to be somewhat deterministic. They're going to funnel a student through a particular path, and most students are going to look at that and say, shoot, I could get out of here a year earlier and save a whole bunch of money if I went down this particular path. It might not be the most interesting one to me. It might not be risky, but something that's kind of, I want to explore that part of my life. That's the kind of thing that we want our students to do, is sort of personalize and do an interesting things, explore their interests. So that one tool could do something that's really great, allow them to personalize their education and give them a place where they can sort of explore different pathways, or it can be really deterministic. So, I mean, is there as much of a advantage or is a danger to these tools? Like, it's not just, you know, personalization is great. I'm glad we're going down that pathway. It can be used for evil just as easily. So, any thoughts on that? I mean, is that just like the reality of the situation, and that's what's going to happen? Or is there ways that we can sort of craft these tools to, I mean, I know that you're really interested in the user experience and like how we present this information. I mean, is there a way that we can mitigate that problem by?
Okay, so first of all, I think that you described a really interesting scenario. I think that's where we are at the moment. We do have tools that people can use. We're starting to scratch the surface a little bit of what we can do with software and different types of interfaces. And people will start to use them and we'll move forward and we'll get better at doing this. So first of all, I'm all in favor of giving people tools to be able to help them to make decisions. So, for example, I know that there is a tool that's out there at the moment that undergraduate students can use, where they can go in and they can say, how many credits have I taken? I'm working towards a certain degree. These are the courses that I still have to take. Now, if I were to change my major to another degree, where would that leave me? And I think that tools like that are wonderful because they give people options. And they give people visions of what could be. And so, and that's a very crude tool that we have at Penn State. It's not a sophisticated interface, but it exists. And I think that that's wonderful. So I think that all of those tools are steps towards improvement.
Isn't part of that model need to be not just the path, but the passion? Students shouldn't take the easiest road. It should be the road that drives them to do what they love. So somehow, as part of that model, there has to be some component that is, what is your passion? What drives you? Okay, based on your passions, these are your potential paths. If you could build something like that in, I mean, that's actually, in the Civitas overviews, that was one of the things that excited me. If you could do something like that, then I think you could really get some value out of
So,
that type of model.
so I started out at Penn State as a computer engineering major.
Mhm.
And I got interested in computer animation, and I ended up changing my major to integrative art so that I could explore this totally different thing. That was an interesting call to my father when I told him I was doing that. But that was just something I got a passion for. It was something I was interested in, combined with different aspects of my background, and I pursued that. And it was like a totally risky thing, and it paid off so much for me. It was the best decision I ever made in my life. I just wonder if I had a system in place before I change my major to integrative arts, I'm going to look at the system and I'm going to look at the probability of success. And it's like crap, I have to take an extra year and a half of classes now, and it's going to cost so much money. And maybe I shouldn't do that. So the algorithms don't take passion into account.
That's the challenge.
So
The word passion, I think, is overused, but I think it's also incredibly important. And my belief as an educator is actually that if you can generate passion within a person, you've done your job. Because once you're passionate about something, you will find your path.
Can I? Oh, go ahead, Greg. You go.
And again, it gets back to how you use the data, because the students then, when they walk out with that, it's about 37,000. Much of the biggest increase in their debt is the 5th year. Many parents, the parents are helping to fund it, they prepared for 4 years, and that 5th year, the 6th year, it gets worse. So you could help a student, and frequently what happens is some students make a mistake. They get out of sequence in an engineering course, but other students say, I'm going to study abroad, and this summer I'm going to take 2 other courses or whatever in some other area. But at least if the student has the data, they can say, look, if you do this, it's going to cost you X amount of dollars. So it helps inform the decision, but it's still the student, or the parent might say, well, you might want to do that, and I love your passion, but this is all I have. As a side, we also see students who borrow a whole lot of money because they can, and then they get a new car. Look, if you buy this car, you're going to be paying for this many years. So again, it's just more data, but it's still the student's choice. The parents don't say, no, you stay in. It's like any technology, it's how you use it. Push back on me, I think you and I disagree on this, maybe, but
No,
I'm so glad you're thinking about this, because this is the things that we need to have the foundational conversations about. Just an aside, the president started a committee looking at helping students reduce cost of the grade. And this all ties into it. And the provost made that statement. Years ago, people used to say, the freshman orientation, look to the right, look to the left, one of you won't graduate. He's saying, well, we've done a good job of selecting students. Our job is to look to the right and look to the left and use adaptive learning technologies to ensure they all succeed. And we have that case. We don't have it now, but as you look at what they're doing at Carnegie Mellon and the companies you talk about, the student, we have it high quality they're going to fail. You might be able to do something to help them to succeed as opposed to telling them don't do it. That's a lot of stuff. But, first of all, thank you for thinking about this. This is so good.
Could I just interject a bit? We have a question from Chi Dunsworth up at Barron campus that we just might not have time to get to today. And I'm going to suggest, Chris, if I can, that we might want to continue this dialogue along some different paths. There's a group, if I can just make offer an idea, there's a group we don't have represented around here today, and that would be the students. What do students think and feel, and how are they inputting on this? Perhaps we can reconvene this group in a couple months and invite some student perspectives in here. Well, that may be a really interesting, mix of dialogue.
yeah, maybe once we're farther down the line with Civitas and we have something to show them to sort of contextualize it, that's a great idea. Yeah, there's clearly more to talk about here than we can
Than we have time for. Yeah.
Any final parting thoughts from our panelists? Not that this wasn't enough. But we covered.
I've got this picture in my mind of the future of education, where things are competency-based, where that there are, for core courses that students are going to be taking, that there are going to be institutions that allow people essentially to take a test to demonstrate their competency. And they can build their knowledge in lots of different ways. So they can go to an institution where they can take a course, they can take a MOOC, they can access resources that are available online. And there's going to be lots and lots of online education. And that online education is going to be offered by different institutions. And I'm trying to imagine what that's going to look like in the future, where data is made available about the success rates of those institutions, and the quality of the education that's coming out of that institution. And so if you can select a particular course from one of 100 different institutions that are online, you've got price that's going to influence your decision, and you've also got success rate that's going to influence your decision, and also measures of quality that are going to influence your decision. If all of that is out there, what is that going to say about how an institution should be moving forward and about how it should be presenting itself in terms of those metrics?
Yeah. So I think one tweak I'd make to your vision is the word course. So right now we are sort of dominated by the idea of a course, which is a certain size, and it's been that way since 1904. And that's like wacky, right? Why do we put everything in that same size package? Why won't these little competencies, these little abilities, outcomes be, freestanding? And once they are freestanding, then you can have an Amazon.com sort of a thing with a digital badging kind of a validation on these things. And then that badge, that competency becomes a place where individuals can place comments. So you get that quality rating from the student perspective, maybe from the employer perspective, other things. So I think it's inevitable that we're going to end up in a place where modular, competency-based learning is what a lot of people are buying. You may still, if we don't give them the ability to aggregate that back and call it a degree, then I think we are missing a great bet, because right now higher education has a monopoly on the most important credential. But I think there will be others who are selling viable learning experiences, others with credentials, selling viable learning alternatives.